Hey guys, welcome back. Today we're going to take a look at Chapter 3, which is focusing on the English colonies growing in North America. The focus of this chapter is from 1619 to 1700. So we are also seeing a change over time, expanding from that first generation of English colonists onward. So let's go back to Virginia. Remember, Jamestown was founded in 1607 by the English, the Virginia Company of London. And by 1612, they've realized that there is no gold just laying on the beaches when they get off of the boat. But luckily for the colonists in Virginia, John Rolfe arrives in 1612, and he smuggles with him into the colony tobacco seeds. Now, this was supposed to be only for the Spanish to grow. They had tried to have a monopoly on tobacco, but John Rolfe has brought it in. They quickly realize in Virginia that tobacco grows very, very easily. And since there is such a high demand for tobacco back in Europe, this is what really saves the Virginia colony, because they are able to easily grow it with their soil and their growing season, and therefore make a profit and remain sustainable. This becomes a cash crop. So year after year after year, the Virginia colonists are growing tobacco without any sort of crop rotation. This is going to destroy the soil in the long run, because the soil is being depleted of the same nutrients year after year after year. But when you're making this kind of profit, the Virginians don't really care. They continue to grow tobacco. This is also going to mean, because there is so much money to be made in tobacco, that there is now going to be a demand for more labor. The colonists originally try to use indentured servitude, which we will talk about later, where you pay for somebody's passage to the New World in exchange for 7 years of labor. That's going to last for a short period of time, but ultimately it's going to turn to African slavery. Now, in 1619, the first 20 Africans arrived in Jamestown. Now, historians are not quite clear what their status was. Were they treated as slaves, owned for life, or were they treated as indentured servants and granted their freedom after 7 years? This is still hotly debated, but regardless of what their status was, Africans, and ultimately African Americans, their descendants, have been part of the American experience almost from the beginning. Very ironically, in the same year of 1619, the House of Burgesses was also created. This is a representative government for the Virginia colony, with some ability to participate, with white landowning men over 21 able to vote for representation in the House of Burgesses. So once again, when we're thinking to the future of the American experience, representative government has also been here almost from the beginning. Now, King James I, he's getting a little anxious about the Virginia colony. He also really doesn't like tobacco, and he's worried about the power that the Virginia Company of London has acquired. So in 1624, he revoked their charter and made them a royal colony under his direct control. Here you see an ad to come to Virginia because there's money to be made. This is a map that was actually drawn by John Smith of Virginia, and you can see where the different villages of the Powhatan were, and up in the left-hand corner they have drawn a picture of the chief of the Powhatans himself. Here is the lovely Pocahontas. I forgot to mention that John Rolfe also married Pocahontas as a way to end the First Anglo-Powhatan War. So that was the merger of those two groups. Okay, so moving beyond Jamestown and the Virginia colony more specifically, let's take a look at Maryland and how Maryland was formed as one of the original colonies for the English. Now, Lord Baltimore, he's a wealthy Catholic back in England, and Catholics were seriously persecuted back in Europe. So he is looking for a place to create a safe haven, a refuge for his fellow wealthy Catholic friends. He receives a land grant and creates the colony of Maryland to protect those wealthy Catholic friends of his. And it sits very close, I should say, to Virginia. It's right on the Chesapeake Bay by the St. Mary River. Now, two things happening down over in Maryland. Number one, you've got a wealthy Catholic aristocracy, the uppity ups of Maryland society, and they are clashing with the low class, the poor Protestant farmers in the region. So there's two levels of conflict here. One is religious conflict between the Protestants versus the Catholics. There is also a social class conflict going on here between low class and the wealthy class. So keep that in the back of your mind as well. And just like we saw over in Virginia, tobacco saves the colony of Maryland. They're able to easily grow it there, and at least in the beginning, they're going to try to use indentured servants as their guaranteed labor force. But that's going to become dicey in the years to come, because if they are constantly being granted freedom after 7 years of service, they're going to have to keep bringing in more and more and more indentured servants. Now, as far as Maryland is concerned, there is a focus of some religious tolerance. And in 1649, Maryland created the Act of Toleration. Sometimes it's called the Toleration Act, to grant religious tolerance to all Christians, aka all Protestants and all Catholics. But even though in our modern idea of religious tolerance, we think of that for everyone, that is not the case in Maryland. If you were Jewish or an atheist, it meant the death penalty. So while they might not have our modern ideas of religious tolerance, it is the beginning of our ideal of, freedom of religion that we see here in modern day United States. Here you see the Maryland colony being created and also the Virginia colony being created. One thing to note, these two colonies together make up the Chesapeake colonies. That's important to know. These are the Chesapeake colonies. Notice its proximity to the Chesapeake Bay. That's why they are called the Chesapeake colonies, Maryland and Virginia. Okay, so even though the Caribbean is not part of modern day United States, the West Indies, as it was called then, the Caribbean, was part of these English colonies at the time. Now, we're seeing the decline at this time of Spain and the power that Spain has. The English are all too happy to grab up some of those colonies down in the Caribbean that the Spanish are losing, particularly the island of Barbados. The English acquired this in 1655. Now, down in the Caribbean, it is extremely hot, long growing season, and the soil is perfect for growing sugarcane. Sugarcane is considered a, quote, rich man's crop. It takes a lot of land to grow sugarcane. There is a long process to turn sugarcane into the finished product of sugar. And so only the very wealthy to begin with were able to afford the amount of land and the amount of processing things and the amount of labor that they needed to grow sugarcane. So this is considered a rich man's crop. But I should tell you this, that if you are growing sugar, you are making tons and tons of money on it. You are growing even richer than you already were to begin with. So for a lot of the non-sugar growers down in Barbados, for the poorer people who couldn't afford to grow sugar, they were growing other crops, the land is just too valuable and they are quickly being pushed out because the sugar growers want to grow nothing but sugar down there. These non-sugar growers are leaving the island of Barbados and they are moving to the other English colonies, namely the Carolinas, that we'll talk about on the next slide here. They're bringing with them their ideas about slavery. By the mid-1600s, African slaves outnumber whites 4-1 in Barbados. And so the colony has already created, quote, slave codes. Number one, it is racially based, that your race will be one determinant of whether you are enslaved or not. 2, you are held for life, and all of your children and their children are held for life. Very, very strict codes in order to control that large African population on the island of Barbados, right? It is a way for the whites to maintain dominance. So not only are those non-sugar growers leaving Barbados and moving to the Carolinas, but they're bringing with them their ideas of slavery and these slave codes that will ultimately filter through the other English colonies in North America. So speaking of the Carolinas, the colony of Carolina, just one, was created by the quote Lord Proprietors in 1670. Charles II gave a land grant to 8 of his closest friends at court to create the colony of Carolina. And their number one job was to grow food stuff for those sugar growers down in Barbados. Remember, if we're only growing sugar down in Barbados, we still have to eat. So Carolina's job is to grow that food to export down to Barbados to feed the sugar growers. Their number one product that they're growing is rice. That is their, quote unquote, cash crop. And for the time, they had originally tried Native American slavery down in Carolina, using the Tuscarora tribe as their slaves. But, as we've talked about before, number one, Native Americans are dying, 90% death rate. That is that is not a very stable labor force if they are dying off in droves. 2, they can easily run away and blend in. Also not a very viable labor source if you are looking to maintain constant labor. And as those Barbados non-sugar growers come in, they're bringing their ideas of slavery. And so we also start to see the growth of African slavery in Carolina to maintain a guaranteed labor force. We also see in Carolina a difference between the very, very poor, mostly up in the northern portion of Carolina, a poorer group of people, versus the quote-unquote landed gentry, meaning like the wealthy people, like gentlemen who are wealthy because they own a lot of land. That we see that type of person more down in the southern portion of Carolina, closer to, quote, Charlestown, what we call Charleston today. And even though the different experience of the different colonies changes, whether they're growing food stuff or it's religion or whatever it is, one thing that the English colonies have in common is their treatment of Native Americans. It is rejection of Native Americans. Like I said, they tried using Native American slavery. That doesn't work. Constant warfare continues, like we've seen elsewhere, that by 1720, the majority of tribes along the East Coast are all but obliterated by the English colonists, either destroyed or killed off with disease or pushed further into the interior of North America. And in Carolina, once again, this idea of religious tolerance, there is some religious tolerance available to those living in Carolina, but not for everybody. There is religious tolerance to Protestants, Catholics not so much, and everyone else not so much. This is a huge difference when you contrast that down to Spanish Florida. Remember, Florida is owned by Spain at this moment, and they are heavily Catholic. So that is going to create conflict between Carolina and the Catholic Spanish down in Florida, which is going to lead to some warfare between the Spanish and the English as well. Now, how does Carolina turn into 2 different colonies, North and South? Well, I told you there was already a growing difference between the northern portion of Carolina and the southern portion of Carolina. The northern portion, which is pretty close to Virginia, squatters have been moving down into the northern portion of Carolina, people that don't have a legal right to that land. Religious dissenters, outcasts, etc., have been moving and just living in the northern portion of Carolina. It is drastically different than that independent spirit compared to the more wealthy landed gentry that we see in the southern portion of Carolina. Also, there are heavily forested areas that kind of separate them, etc. So that by 1712, there's a split between the 2 colonies. North Carolina becomes a separate colony from South Carolina. But once again, they are going to work together to crush those Native American tribes. Okay. Let's also take a look at Georgia. Georgia is actually the last of the 13 original colonies to be created. It was founded in 1733 by James Oglethorpe. Now, I'm going to come back to this slide here in a second. I just want to show you the map here on the next one. Notice its proximity, where Georgia is compared to the Spanish down in Florida versus the Carolinas. You know, our food growers up here in the Carolinas who are feeding the sugar growers down in Barbados, they're so valuable. But the Spanish down in Florida continuously are raiding and attacking and burning crops, etc., up in the Carolinas. We need to keep them safe. So in 1733, Georgia is created as a separate colony to serve as a buffer, almost a protection between the Spanish down in Florida and our food growers up in the Carolinas. So that is its original purpose, to serve as a buffer, a safety net between the Spanish down in Florida, and I should also say the French over in Louisiana. But from James Oglethorpe's perspective, the founder, he wants to create a penal colony in Georgia, a debtor's colony, to institute criminal justice reform, for lack of a better term. You know, back in England, if you were in debt, aka anyone who was poor, you could be thrown into debtor's prison and live there until you can pay off your debt, which for some people is never. You can never pay off your debt. So instead of having the prisons bursting at the seams with people living in debt back in England, let's ship them off to the colonies and create a colony with them. So James Oglethorpe is looking to create some reform here. Australia was also created as a debtor's colony, just a fun fact. But because they are serving as protection for the Carolinas, there's a lot of money from the English government to create Georgia. And like I said, Oglethorpe is trying to create some reform. And in fact, he does try to keep out African slavery for some time. Ultimately, it doesn't succeed in keeping African slavery out. And once again, there is religious tolerance to all Protestants in Georgia. So, take a look at this. So we talked about the Chesapeake colonies of Maryland and Virginia. It is also important to note what the southern colonies were, namely North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. These are the southern colonies. You could also include the Caribbean colonies down here, the West Indies. But what they have in common is they are quote-unquote plantation colonies. Whoops. They grow cash crops, things like tobacco or rice or sugar or indigo. They are growing these cash crops, meaning ultimately they are going to become very reliant on African slavery as a guaranteed labor force through the coming years. They are a much more aristocratic area because with more land comes more wealth, more power, etc. And so over time, over the generations, those landowners become the wealthy aristocracy of Southern societies. Because this land is so valuable to grow these cash crops, the weather is perfect, the soil is perfect for growing these cash crops. You're not going to see a lot of cities within these southern colonies. This is still true today. Because why waste the land to grow a city that we could be growing more tobacco or sugar or rice or whatever the cash crop is? And so one of the hallmarks of these southern colonies is they're very, very spread out. You're not going to see over time as large of a population as you'll see elsewhere. The population is not densely located. That's going to be important moving forward, even until the Civil War coming, hundreds of years from this moment. But what is common, and this is common with all of them, is the relationship or lack of relationship with Native Americans. As more and more settlers come, or as more and more of them are born, they continue expanding westward into the continent, which is just going to mean more conflict with more Native tribes in the years to come. Okay. So let's shift gears now and move to the northern portion of what is today the United States, the New England colonies. Okay, so we've talked about the Chesapeake colonies, we've talked about the southern colonies. Let's go up to New England. Now, before we can even talk about the New England colonies, we have to acknowledge the Protestant Reformation again. This was that European event, or the European event going on, where People were protesting against the Catholic Church. They want to reform the Catholic Church. It really starts with Martin Luther over in Germany in 1517, nailing his 95 theses, the 95 things he did not like about the Catholic Church, to the door of the Wittenberg Cathedral. And it really takes off from there. Another Protestant reformer was John Calvin. John Calvin and his followers are sometimes called Calvinists. His big idea was that if God is omniscient, if God is all-knowing, then God already knows who is predestined to go to either heaven or hell. And nothing we can do during our lives is going to change that. From even before you're born, your ticket to heaven or hell has already been punched by an omniscient God. So no amount of good works or what you do here on earth is going to change your status for the afterlife. But we as human beings don't know whether we are predestined for heaven or hell. So we're just sitting around waiting to get a message from God, or what was called the, quote, conversion. Think of God knocking on your door and saying, hey, congratulations, you're predestined to go to heaven. We are waiting for that sign from God. And when that conversion or that message from God comes, the believers of Calvinism become the, quote, visible saints. They are the true believers, the ones going to heaven. And they then will have a lot more power and prestige within that religion. Now, followers of John Calvin, we sometimes refer to them as Puritans. Their official church is the Congregationalist Church. It's all the same. They follow the teachings of John Calvin. And the reason we call them Puritans is because over in England, when Henry VIII separated from the Catholic Church in order to marry a new queen, he replaced himself as the head of that church to create the Church of England, sometimes called the Anglican Church. But other than that, he really didn't change anything about the Church of England. The believers of John Calvin are like, wait, we haven't gone far enough. We need to purify this Church of England. We need to continue reforming, hence the nickname, the Puritans. But their official church is the Congregationalist Church, and they believe in John Calvin's teachings about predestination. So, over in England, these Puritans are trying to practice their religion, but they are being persecuted. They are being attacked. They are being jailed for not following the Church of England. So a small group of these Puritans are like, enough, we're out. They left. They separated from England. We call these people the Pilgrims. It is a small group of Puritans who left England in 1608. They are also sometimes referred to as the Separatists. They moved to Holland in order to be able to freely practice their religion. The problem, though, with living in Holland is that their children are almost becoming Dutchified. They're turning into little Dutch children. Well, these Puritans don't want their children to be Dutch. They want them to be English, but just practice their religion. So in 1620, they left Holland on board the Mayflower. The Mayflower was heading for Virginia. Somehow it ended off course. Maybe it was a storm. Maybe they paid off the captain. Who knows? But somehow they veered completely wildly off course and ended up in what we call New England today. Their colony that they're going to create is Plymouth. So before these people get off the Mayflower in the newly created colony of Plymouth, they sign a Mayflower Compact. This is a rudimentary government. They don't have a legal right. They don't have a charter to be in Plymouth. So they create this compact, a very crude, rudimentary government, in order to govern themselves while living in what we call Plymouth at the time. That first winter, as you already know from the stories about Thanksgiving, is extremely deadly. They're freezing to death, they're starving to death, disease, etc. None of them go back after that deadly first winter. And in fact, they work with the local tribes to learn how to grow food and, all the other things that we've learned about, and thus leading to our first very mythical Thanksgiving. The first governor of the Plymouth colony is William Bradford, and he served for 30 years. Keep in mind, this Plymouth colony up in New England is very religiously based, right? They are there to practice their religion. Here you see the modern day recreated Plymouth colony. Here you see the regions that they were leaving out of England from on their way over to the New World, particularly in the darker orange is what I mean. Okay, so another colony that we are going to see grow up in New England is the Massachusetts Bay Colony. This is going to be the big New England colony. Now, all those Puritans who had stayed behind back in England, by 1629, they are really getting beaten down by Charles I. There is massive crackdowns on Puritans back in England. So they're like, enough is enough. We need to leave too. And we are going to see a great migration, thousands and thousands of English leaving England, heading for the New World. A good chunk of those leaving for the New World are Puritans. Now, the Puritans are like, well, where are we going to go? Hey, I know, there's already some other Puritans living in Plymouth. Why don't we create a colony pretty close to them? And we'll call it the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So they formed this colony because of its proximity to Plymouth, where the other Puritans were already living. The first governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony was John Winthrop. And on board the Arabella, the ship that was bringing John Winthrop to the New World, he gave a very famous sermon to his fellow believers. We sometimes refer to it as the City Upon a Hill sermon. Its official title is A Model of Christian Charity. Sometimes you'll hear it referred to as the Arabella sermon. It's all the same, because the most famous line out of it is, "We shall be a city upon a hill." He's looking to create this Massachusetts Bay Colony as a beacon for the rest of the world. We've got to do it perfectly. We've got to show the rest of the world why we are God's chosen people, that we are going to create this perfect Christian kingdom in Massachusetts Bay and follow all the rules. And if we do, God will bestow us with lots and lots of good stuff. And that'll show the rest of the world why we are the best and they should follow our behavior. We shall be a city upon a hill. So what this is telling us is that Massachusetts, there is no separation between church and state. God's law is law. The Massachusetts Bay is a theocracy, a religiously run government. John Winthrop is the governor, but here he is giving a sermon that tells you how connected religion is to the government. But you can't live on religion. So there is still some focus on economic endeavors, right? The primary focus of their economy up in Massachusetts Bay is going to be small scale farming. They're not going to have huge plantations because, number one, the growing season is shorter and the soil isn't as good. But they are still predominantly small scale farmers. Shipbuilding and fishing are the other primary economic focuses up in Massachusetts Bay. And like I said, God's law is law. The only people allowed to vote in Massachusetts Bay are visible saints, those men who have received that message from God that they are predestined for heaven. Here is John Winthrop, that first governor of Massachusetts Bay. And here you see the locations that these great migration people are coming to. A lot of them coming to New England, obviously the Chesapeake Bay, and obviously down to the West Indies. But thousands pouring out of England coming to the New World. Okay. So thinking about Massachusetts Bay, everything is geared towards social harmony, everyone being the same, doing what you're supposed to. I almost think of it like the Stepford Wives. You've got to be perfect. Nobody can dissent because we've got to be this perfect Christian kingdom, this city upon a hill. And so what do they do with people who don't agree? Well, it isn't going to be good. Quakers were flogged, executed, or expelled. But what do they do with fellow Puritans who don't agree? Well, it's going to be bad for them too. Two examples, Anne Hutchinson and Roger Williams. Let's talk about Roger Williams first. 1636, Roger Williams was banished from the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He'd had issues with the fact that the English had stolen this land from the Native Americans. That was one problem he had with the Massachusetts Bay. He also had a problem with this connection between religion and government. He thought there should be separation of church and state. So Roger Williams, because he is going against the power structure in Massachusetts Bay, was kicked out. But he established Rhode Island as a safe haven where truly people could practice their religion. They paid the Native Americans for the land that they took. And there is true division between church and state up in Rhode Island, real religious freedom. There is no colonial church that you pay taxes to. It is much different compared to the Massachusetts Bay. So things worked out for him up in Rhode Island, not so much for Anne Hutchinson. Anne Hutchinson, a woman, once again, says, you know what? If I'm predestined for heaven, I don't need to follow man's law anymore. Why do I need to do what John Winthrop and the rest of the colonial leaders are telling me to do? God's already told me I'm predestined for heaven. So who are you to tell us what to do? She also held Bible study meetings in her house where she was teaching other women and men about the religion. She is not a very well-behaved woman, if you know what I'm saying. And so she was put on trial and she was ultimately banished from the Massachusetts Bay. It didn't end well for her. Her and her entire family were killed in a Native American attack just outside of New York. So things don't end well for people who go against the high-ups within the Church of the Massachusetts Bay. Here is a statue of Anne Hutchinson. Okay, here you also see some of the other New England colonies. We talked about Massachusetts Bay, we talked about Plymouth, and we talked about Rhode Island. You need to also do your reading to look at the two Connecticut colonies of Hartford and New Haven. These make up the quote-unquote New England colonies. Okay, so up in New England, once again, like we see elsewhere, things are not really different when it comes to treatment of Native Americans. Even before the Pilgrims arrived, 3/4 of the tribes were already dead from these diseases. You know, maybe they'd come in contact with white fishermen from down in Virginia or Maryland, and it killed off the majority of these Native Americans. Hence why the Wampanoag were somewhat open to working with the Pilgrims when they showed up, because there might be some mutual benefit to this new group on the scene. But as time goes on and more settlers arrive in New England, as we've seen elsewhere, it leads to hostile relationships because it's about gaining the land. And in 1637, as one example, we see the Pequot War, more of a massacre, when an entire village of Pequot men, women, and children were surrounded by Puritan settlers. They set it on fire and killed every single person in the village. So in 1675, as almost a last stand, a last-ditch attempt by New England Native American tribes, Chief Metacom, he tries to create a pan-Indian alliance, basically traveling from village to village, regardless of the tribe, saying, hey, let's put aside our differences. Let's band together and try to stop this white infiltration as Native Americans against the white English coming in. The English refer to Metacom as King Philip. Who knows why? I guess it's easier for them to remember. But this is called King Philip's War, warfare between the English in New England versus Native American tribes. It doesn't end well for the Native Americans. Metacom is killed. The tribes are disbanded, either killed or pushed to the interior. But King Philip's War marks kind of the last-ditch attempt by New England tribes to push back against the English colonization going on. This last attempt at resistance. Here you see a wood engraving of this massacre of a Pequot village. Here you see a drawing of Metacom, aka King Philip. Okay, so as time goes on, the colonists up in New England are getting a little taste for self-government, for autonomy, to govern themselves. By 1643, they've created the New England Confederation. Specifically, this is a combination of many of the New England tribes. They've excluded Rhode Island because they don't really like them too much, to kind of work together for common issues like defense and things like that. They're getting a taste for self-government, to be in control of themselves. But things are really hitting the fan back in England. England is devolving into a civil war. Charles I was executed. Um, his son comes back to power. It's a mess. And Charles II is none too happy with the Puritans, namely because the Puritans back in England were the ones who had killed his father, but that's English history. And he imposes on New England the dominion of New England. Instead of letting them have power over themselves, England is going to take a heavier hand in controlling New England. This is taking away some of the power the New England colonists had become used to, and they begin enforcing what are called the navigation laws. Now, the purpose of colonies, guys, is to make money for the mother country, right? That's called mercantilism. That is the economic policy of mercantilism. The mother country creates a colony. They are going to take all of the natural resources out of that colony, send it back to the mother country, turn it into finished products, and then force the colonies to buy those finished products. They become a guaranteed market for the mother country so that the mother country can make money off of it. That's called mercantilism. The laws to enforce this mercantilism in New England, or actually all of the English colonies, were called the navigation laws. Basically, you have to buy from English merchants. If you try to buy from French merchants or Spanish merchants, you will pay a heavy, heavy tax. That's part of the navigation laws, so that all the money is flowing to England. But more problems are circulating throughout England. Charles II is overthrown. His daughter and son-in-law come to the throne during the Glorious Revolution. And during this period of time, while England is trying to figure out what it's doing, England kind of turns its back. The navigation laws are still on the books, but they're kind of turning a blind eye to what's going on over in the colonies in the New World. This is a period of time called salutary neglect. The law is still there, but nobody is enforcing it. So it's another window of time where the English colonies are kind of getting used to doing what they want to do. And that's going to lead us over time, eventually, long time from now, to the American Revolution. Okay, so those are the New England colonies. Let's take a look at our final group of colonies called the Middle Colonies. Now, we've already talked about New York. New York is one example of a middle colony. The other middle colonies are Pennsylvania, Delaware, New Jersey. These are the middle colonies. They are the breadbasket colonies, where they are growing lots of crops like wheat and grain and oats and barley, right? The quote-unquote cereal crops, the breadbasket. We're going to feed the colonies with all this stuff. So over in Pennsylvania, the creation of Pennsylvania, Quakers, this is a religious denomination, they are seriously persecuted everywhere they go by everyone. William Penn, back in England, was a Quaker convert. The king had actually owed his father a ton of money. So in order to pay off William Penn, he gave him a land grant in 1681. William Penn is going to use this land grant to create Pennsylvania, Penn's Forest, as a safe haven for his Quaker brethren. They come to Pennsylvania, and they're going to have very peaceful relations, or at least they're going to try peaceful relations with the Native American tribes, paying them for the land, etc. They're also going to have very, very open tolerance to pretty much every religion. Everyone is welcome in Pennsylvania, which is going to make it one of the fastest growing colonies in the New World because everyone's able to go to Pennsylvania and have some level of tolerance. They're also going to try full representation with male landowners, right? Another example of self-government. And so because they are pretty tolerant, they are very, very rapid, quick growing, the fastest growing colony there is. This is also going to encompass the colonies of New Jersey and also Delaware, which actually remained under Quaker control until the Revolution. But this rounds out the quote-unquote middle colonies, the breadbasket colonies, where they are growing grains and things. Think of Quaker Oats. That's William Penn on the cover of the Quaker Oats box. Here you see a picture of William Penn signing a treaty with the local tribes. And here you see all of the North American colonies. The Southern colonies, or the Plantation Colonies. The Chesapeake Colonies, here in the middle. The Middle Colonies, here, the breadbasket. And finally, the New England colonies up in the north. That is it for Chapter 3, guys, and I will talk to you later.